Transformational Tuesdays. Okay. Hello, everyone. Today in CTA Transformational Tuesdays, we have Geraldine Anathan with us. So let's give you a short bio about Geraldine. Geraldine Anathan has a professional development firm based in New York City, Aspen, and Boston. She works with clients globally and has a mission to make interpersonal growth accessible to all people. She also helps organizations foster high-performing teams. Jerry also launched the Neuroscience for Leaders program, helping individuals tap into their full potential through self-awareness. When she is not coaching, she loves skiing, biking, and film. About our today's webinar, psychological safety, what it is and why it matters. If you don't feel safe in a group, you are likely to keep ideas to yourself and avoid speaking up even about risks. Low psychological safety gets in the way of both team performance, innovation, learning, and personal success. As a result of this webinar, you will hear science-based research on the characteristics of high-performing teams. You will be introduced to the psychological safety instrument developed by the Fearless organization, and will also learn a process to help individuals and organizations increase their psychological safety over time. So welcome, Jerry, please.
Hi, thank you. I hope you can all hear me okay. And before we get started, I will be introducing myself and going through the agenda for this hour that we have together. But as you see at the top of this first slide, what we'll be using today is an interactive platform, and it's completely optional. If you don't want to do it, that's okay. But if you are willing and you would like to, you can go onto another device, perhaps your cell phone or something like that, and go into menti.com, or simply open another browser on your computer and you'll be able to follow along. So when you get to menti.com, you'll just see a little screen that asks for a code, and you would put in this number at the top, which is, I'll read it aloud in case you can't see it. It's 88643168. And you should see a screen that looks like, well, you can't really see it on my computer because I've got the fade, but if you're having any problems, don't worry about it. It's not urgent, but it's just a way for us to interact together throughout this time together. So the introduction by Mahmoud was perfect, and we can just, I'll go through this very quickly just to move through it. I live in New York City and also in Massachusetts on Cape Cod, which is the peninsula that goes out into the Atlantic Ocean. I'm an executive and team coach. And recently, I'm a founding member of a small organization called Leadership Coach Group. And I'm certified in a lot of different things. I think some of my favorite ones are coaching the unconscious mind. Of course, this fearless organization work that we'll be talking about today with psychological safety. I also am a yoga studio owner. And so we do a lot of yoga, meditation, mindfulness, that type of thing. And my favorite education that I've gotten in my coaching career is from NYU, courses at Harvard, positive psychology, and the Center for Executive Coaching. So that's a little bit about me. And now for our first interaction with this Menti platform, if you are on Menti, you can simply type in onto the screen your name and where you are today. And your first name is fine. So I will do it as well, just so we can see if it's working properly. So awesome. We have people from all over the world. New Delhi, Malaysia, India, Dubai, Greece, Yemen. Wow. Amazing. Cool. So just as coaches, I'll just drop in some tips. So I'm giving you this overview today of psychological safety, but I'm also going to drop in some tips that when we create presentations that have this interactivity, it increases the learning by up to 30% or even more, because we're engaged, we're kind of subconsciously more aware of what's happening on our screen. So just a little tidbit around that kind of thing. And thank you so much for everyone joining in on this platform of Menti. It makes it a lot more interactive and fun. So the agenda for today, I'm going to be talking about creating the container, which is something I do when we jump into the psychological safety debriefs. We'll be talking about the evolution of psychological safety in practice, which includes something called Project Aristotle and, of course, the Fearless Organization. Then I'll be talking to you about the psychological safety instrument, which is the same thing as a survey or a scan or an index, and how you as coaches can foster psychological safety in organizations and groups without having to necessarily go through the assessment that you have to be certified for. So hopefully by the end, you'll have some tips that you can take with you on a way forward for coaching high-performing teams. And when I say teams, this can also apply to groups, social groups, family dynamics, that type of thing. So it really is pretty broad. Awesome. So, to talk about psychological safety, sometimes it's best to start with, well, what happens if we don't have psychological safety? So there are a few examples that I will bring up. And if you've already been exposed to psychological safety on an academic level, you've probably heard of some of these examples. But one is the story of a nurse who was administering a drug in a hospital to one of her elderly patients. And she realized that the instructions looked like they were off on the dosage that was written down. So she immediately thought, I'm going to reach out and call the doctor and make sure that this is right. But just as she was going to do the phone call, she remembered that the last time she had bothered him at home, he kind of went ballistic on her. So she thought, I'm not going to call him, and I'm just going to give the drug. Whatever that result was, we won't really go into that. Another example is a co-pilot, a very new trainee as a co-pilot, noticed that his commanding officer had made a small error in their flight, but he knew the temper of this commanding officer. And so he just sort of bit his tongue and kept his eyes on the instruments. So imagine the feelings going through his body, through his mind, sort of that fight or flight response that he may have been having at that moment. And that particular flight did end up ending up in a disastrous situation. Lastly, we'll go to Volkswagen and what happened with their industry over the last couple of decades. And the original CEO of Volkswagen, there were two big things that happened. One was he told his staff that if you don't get the fittings on these Volkswagens right in the next 2 weeks, you're all going to lose your jobs. I have your names, that'll be it. And so this staff was completely panicked, and they ended up staying at work, not sleeping, getting sick, but just pounding through. And they did meet the requirements. So that ended up well. But then what happened was that CEO's predecessor, with this same kind of mentality of how to run a company, told his organization that if they didn't pass emissions, that the entire company could go under. So they falsified the way to read emissions. And I think you can research all of that, and it's a pretty fascinating story. What happened to the staff? What happened to the industry, and the reputation of Volkswagen? And now, currently, the new CEO, what he has to say, or their chief of works, says now we need a culture in which it's possible and permissible to argue with your superior about the best way to go. And that is psychological safety in a nutshell. So how did this whole psychological safety come into being? Well, about a decade ago or so, Google started to think about, what is it that creates these super high functioning, high performing teams? And so, and you can read about this in the New York Times. It's an article that I'll show you shortly. But around 2015, 2016, they came up with the results. And over 180 teams were deeply researched about what is it that creates these high-performing teams. And there were a lot of surprises that came up. So is it that we all have the same education level, and that creates more cohesion? No, that's not it. Is it that we're highly educated? And no, that's not it. Is it that we have social, we're social outside of work, so we're really productive in work? That's what they thought might be one of the things. And no, that wasn't it either. So what they came up was a surprising list of what really creates these high-performing teams. And if you want to look this up in the New York Times, it's the issue that says what Google learned from its quest to build the perfect team. And it's a really fascinating, fantastic article. So what they came up with was this list. And as you look at this list, you can understand that, all of these things make a lot of sense. But what they really discovered in sort of as the underpinning of high performance was that all of these number 2 through 5, you couldn't have, they made no impact at all on the team unless that team had psychological safety. So we've got impact, that your work matters to the world. We've got meaning, that your work is personally meaningful to you and to the team. We've got structure and clarity, so your roles and responsibilities. We've got dependability, where things are getting done on time and you can really depend on one another to get that done. And then we've got psychological safety, which is team members feeling safe to take risks and to be vulnerable in front of others. So before that even happened, how did this term psychological safety come around? Well, about 2 decades ago, Amy Edmondson, who is a leadership expert at Harvard and MIT, she did tons and tons of research and came up with this concept of psychological safety. And then in 2018, she came up with her book called The Fearless Organization. And she then partnered with a group of which I'm now a part that created a scan, the survey that we'll be talking about, and certified others to give that scan. And so there's an organization. So when you hear the term, the Fearless Organization, it's a book, but it's also a concept where companies, organizations can become these psychologically safe environments for others, for all of their teams. So the true definition of psychological safety is that it is a shared belief that the team is safe for taking interpersonal risks. So it's a team concept, but as an individual, it's a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And I'm going to go through a few of the concepts. So when we first hear this, we kind of think, is this like a touchy-feely, emotionally driven concept to bring into organizations? And the truth is it's not. It is truly what creates high performance. So it's not just about feeling good. It's about creating high performance amongst teams. And psychological safety exists when you're obviously able to be yourself. You can take risks. You can show up to make mistakes. You can raise issues or problems, and you can disagree. And you can ask questions that you might feel are, silly questions, or did they already go over that? Or is my question going to sound threatening to someone? Are they going to feel like I'm challenging them by asking a question about a concept that they're working on? So we have an opportunity here to interact again. So what might keep you, or let's say a client of yours that you know very well, who might be having issues at work, what might keep you from being yourself with your team or your group or your social setting? So just imagine yourself in a certain situation that's more of a regular situation. And what is it that keeps you from being 100% yourself? Okay, yeah, what would I look like if I say something that doesn't resonate with others? Being blamed, exactly. Myself, so just sort of that that subconscious halting when we're in front of a group. Judgment, rejection, lack of knowledge, a sad face, feeling stupid, insecurity, judgment, ego, lack of confidence. Great. So when we think about all of that negative emotion and response that we can feel, this insecurity, a lack of knowledge, what if I look stupid? I'm judged, I'm blamed, stigma, loss of respect, all of these things. What if those didn't exist? And we've worked with companies that now have eliminated just so much of that feeling. And I'm not sure if you can see this red thing across my screen. I don't know where it came from, but it's on my screen. Can you guys see it? It's like a mark across my screen. Yeah. We'll see if it goes away. Another issue that happens is that companies, when they're considering doing work in psychological safety, they think, are my people going to be feeling too safe? And then they're just not going to be accountable, because now they can show up to work with this incredible feeling of freedom and expression. And so is it going to turn our work environment into something that's not productive? And that's exactly not true. There is no balancing point where you can only be a little bit psychologically safe. The more psychologically safe we are, the more we're willing to take on more work and be more accountable and help our team members and really thrive as an organization that is innovative. So this sort of shows options of, where are we? So if we are low on psychological safety and low in our motivation and accountability, we're going to be pretty apathetic. And if we're super psychologically safe, but we're not at all motivated, or no one's holding us accountable, there's a chance that we might just go into this comfort zone that's in the upper left corner. And then if we have no psychological safety and a high amount of accountability or a lot of responsibility, go back to the Volkswagen example, we're going to be in an anxiety zone where, we're constantly stressed, we're releasing cortisol into our system, we're just not thriving. In fact, we're starting to be drained of all energy. When we're high in psychological safety and high in motivation and accountability, that's when we're in the learning zone. And the only way you can get into that innovative stage is by being in the learning zone, by opening your mind to fresh and new ideas. The bottom line is that when we're not psychologically safe, our lens shuts down. So we are just trying to get through the day. It's like that punching into work, punching out of work. And we all know what it feels like to be more in the zone. And that is when, wow, you're so with what's going on and you're feeling really good, and that nothing can hold you back from being yourself. So that is the background of psychological safety. And now let's visit, what is this scan thing? So it's number one, and I'm going to show you in a little bit, you can access this scan for yourself and create your own survey. So while there's a very robust survey that takes a group and does these algorithms and gives you a team score, there are other ways that you as coaches can move through this. So let's just kind of open the dialogue in a little bit after I go through what this is. So the scan is a 7-question scan. It takes like 3 to 5 minutes to fill out. And it's an 8-point Likert scale, from agree to disagree. And what happens is we administer this to everyone who's on a team. So let's say you're on a team of 8 people, the certified person, myself, whoever, would get everyone's email address, send the scan. And then there are 2 reports that the certified person gets. One is just a blank report that we might share with that whole team. The other is a very personalized, it tells me who voted for what. And typically we do not share that with, the company at all, because it's really, it's just not a good idea. It's good for the coach or the, let's say the organizational behaviorist or HR perhaps to have that stuff, but it gets very, these are confidential answers. And we want people to give their most authentic answer, of course, so that we can see what the baseline is for these teams. So here are the questions. And as coaches, sometimes it's hard to put ourselves in the role of the client. But let's just think for a moment of a team that you know about. Maybe you're on a committee or a board or something like that. Or you can think of a client that has been talking to you a lot about their dynamics at work. So they're going to get this scan, or you're going to get the scan. And you don't have to spend a ton of time on these things. You typically know in your mind where you're feeling good and where you're not feeling so good. So if you make a mistake on this team, it's often held against you. Members of this team are able to bring up problems and tough issues. People on this team sometimes reject others for being different. It is safe to take a risk on this team. It's difficult to ask other members on my team for help. And then no one on this team would deliberately act in a way that undermines my efforts. So when we take that scan, it's pretty innocuous. It's done, send it in. The next step is that the coach or whoever's giving this scan receives the reports, and they sort of take a look at it, read through, get an assessment of what's going on with the team. And then we meet with the organization, with that team, for about anywhere from 2 to 2.5 hours. And what typically happens is pretty powerful. And this is where kind of the magic comes in. And we call it a debrief. So usually it's within about 72 hours of them taking that scan, hopefully a little tighter, maybe 48 hours. And what happens is those questions that are asked are then divided down into 4 domains: inclusion and diversity, willingness to help, your attitude toward risk and failure, and open conversation. And as a practitioner, this is just an example of one of the domains that has come back. And this is something around open conversations. So the orange, this is a company that I've worked with. The gray is where they came in on February 24th. And the orange is where they came in as a score on May 18th, just last week. So not only can you see that it was their willingness to have open conversation was much lower in total, you can also see that there's a big differential between all members of the team on that gray bar. Now they're all much tighter. They're all sort of on the same page. They're coming together to be in the same place, and their score is higher. And as you can see, no one rated it 100%, but it's certainly a lot better. Gigantic leaps actually through the work that we did with the group during the debrief. So during the debrief, the first thing that I like to do is what's called creating the container, which I did with the agenda. And when we do any kind of presentation, it's great to have an agenda, but especially when we're working with issues that can be vulnerable, like psychological safety, we want to create a container or set a stage of safety so that people feel that they know what's coming next. It relieves all the anxiety around the upcoming topics. So the first thing I'll ask is that people are, can speak freely, that they have no other distractions, that they're safe to express or feel any emotions of any kind. Sometimes you have yelling, sometimes you have crying, these things happen, but they always move the team forward because we've created this container that what happens in the room really stays in the room. Trusting the process that everything is going to end up okay and better. That, typically that we like to have people's cameras on so we can see each other's emotions. Before COVID, this was a much different kind of thing because we'd be in the room together where you could really feel the energy. And so without, of course, that, we really want to see someone's body language, the looks on their faces, their micro expressions, things like that. And then I'll typically ask what else, and I'll put up a slide that says, is there anything else someone would like to request anonymously to create this container of safety? Once that's been established, we move into the first domain, which is attitude toward risk and failure. And these 4 domains, as a practitioner, you can use them in any sequence you like. What I think is important is keeping open conversation as the last domain, because it is really the most powerful domain. It's really about all the communication. But with attitude toward risk and failure, I will show them their score and then ask questions. So how do you approach high-stake topics? I might also ask, I might even start with, what do you think of your score? If it's a low score, you just want to put it out there. What do you think about this? And then, can you think of a time you didn't take a risk, but you wish you had on this team? And typically people have something to say about that. And have you ever taken a risk without thinking it through and had negative results? So one of the things I want to just mention about what's so powerful about this scan is I had an example of a client in Vancouver where it was they were like a risk management investment fund company. And the CEO is like a pretty young company. They're doing very well, really smart, great people. And Vancouver is a very outdoorsy kind of place. So these are people that definitely have a really high life work balance. Like they love to go biking and hiking. And that's just the whole attitude there that I noticed. But the CEO thought that everyone had 100%. He thought that his group had 100% great attitude toward risk and failure. His entire staff voted the attitude toward risk and failure around a 50. And this is powerful because what's happening is they're just trying to please or kind of mimic or mirror the personality of the CEO when they're all together. So they're just sort of reacting to his sense of confidence, when in reality, they don't have that sense of confidence at all. So imagine that dynamic when we sit down and we display this information anonymously, of course, but he knows he gave it 100 and nobody else did. So that was a very powerful moment. Sometimes the things that we don't know are going to have such impact on a team are hidden from us, and they don't come out until this debrief session. And then anything else. So and I will ask this question. We just kind of went through this, what keeps you from taking risks, showing up fully? We don't have to go through that again, but it's important to ask that in a mentee setting where people can put it in when we're doing a Zoom debrief. And all this is, the terminology around this is impression management. People don't necessarily feel comfortable self-disclosing, and we want to manage our appearance, trying to fit in. We want to integrate and align our actions with others. And that's exactly what happened with that organization in Vancouver. People were just, kind of acting as puppets, trying to align with their CEO. And their company culture now is completely different. And they'll call him out if he's, kind of running with the ball in the wrong direction. And it's working out quite well. So as we've discussed, the things that keep us from taking the risk to speak up are fears of being seen as incompetent, disruptive, negative, or ignorant. And this is all under that umbrella of impression management. The next one is inclusion and diversity. And I'll ask questions like, how does like if I were coaching Volkswagen now, how does Volkswagen now demonstrate inclusion? And how about diversity? Are all voices heard, respected, and encouraged? And this is really important in small meetings, because oftentimes the person who is not speaking up may have the most ideas. And for whatever reason, they're not psychologically safe, so they're not speaking up. And we're now advocating as an option that some groups require everyone not only to give some feedback, but also encouraging and requiring everyone to ask questions. So if someone's doing a presentation, each person in the group has to ask a question or give a comment. It just brings people forward, gets new ideas out there on the table. And by the way, at the end of this, I believe that you will be receiving, I'm going to send in a PDF of these slides so that you'll have them. Willingness to help is a huge one because there are a lot of perceptions that can fly around based on how we consider someone else's energy. So we may not ask for help, and we may not ask if we can help unless we feel psychologically safe. So I'll often again say, what do you think about this score? And that's such an open-ended question. And then I'm just silent, and someone eventually will speak up. Where do you feel helped and supported on this team? So of course we want to bring forward all the positive. And then where do you feel alone? And there have been some amazing breakthroughs here where there was a guy who had held something in for like 18 months that came up in one of these debriefs where he felt that a project he was working on really got shut down with no explanation from a coworker, sort of a vertical, horizontal coworker, and had been harboring this resentment and sadness and anger, and his team was upset because he couldn't push through this initiative, and nobody knew that that had been going on, but he definitely felt alone, that nobody was helping him through this. Where do you feel underutilized? You know, there are people who think and know that they have such great stuff to bring forward to their organizations, but they don't have a way in. And so that can be super frustrating for those people who are really trying to move forward and carry the ball forward. And then a great question always is, what changes would you like to see on this team? And then again, silence. And people typically bring up some great initiatives. And then what could you do personally, individually, to foster willingness to help on this team? And of course, if you're together, we go around the room and say what you could do personally, or if we're on a Zoom call, you know, it might be more efficient to do it again here on one of these interactive platforms like Menti or something like that. The last one, and I think the most powerful, is open conversation, which could be a workshop in itself. There's so much great information about the dynamics, the psychology around conversation. You know, it's really the foundation in some ways of psychological safety. Because if we're not talking, you know, without conversation, we would only be reading one another's body language, and that's not really a way to move forward. So some of the questions here are, how do these results impact your performance as a team? And if it's high, that's great. You know, you can say, you know, we're collaborative, we're cohesive, we're very open, we don't hold back. But if you're low, you want to look at like, wow, what is this impact? You're always having to read someone's mind. You're not carrying ideas forward. You know, you're holding stuff back. You might be getting stress response constantly, wearing down yourself physiologically and emotionally. So we ask questions like, you know, well, where do you bump into each other? And of course, these can be touchy conversations, but they're good conversations and they're facilitated. So they don't escalate. And again, what would you like to see change? What could you do differently? So I just want to share with you a model that I think is really helpful. And it's from a book called Dialogue. And it's sort of an older, it's not a very widely known kind of concept, but what happens, we start in that lower left-hand corner, and we're, as a group, let's imagine all of you are sitting around the table, and I'm here and we're talking, and we're all colleagues, and we're very polite with one another because that's what we do. And we're all together on the same principle. And then let's say I bring up an idea, and some people are like, that's fantastic. And other people are thinking, how could she even say that? Or other people are thinking, that's just not going to work. And suddenly we move into this place of breakdown. So we're still kind of acting polite. As you see, we're in breakdown, we're in different groups. And then we loop back this middle arrow going back to politeness. We're broken down, but we're still acting polite. And that's what we call old thinking. You know, the team breaks down, we kind of shove it under the rug, we act polite, another thing happens, the team breaks down, and it's over and over. New thinking is that we, instead of letting breakdown go back and revert to politeness, we use inquiry, where someone might ask, well, can you tell me more about that idea? Or how does this even fit into what we're talking about? Or maybe it's more of a challenge, like, can you explain how you could even think that would work? Or, and so the inquiry, the questioning, the open-ended questions create more engagement and more connection and collaboration. And maybe it is a little bit of a disagreement, but it's being sussed out as a group. And once we have that state of inquiry as a group, we've talked about it, and in time we go back to flow. We go into a state of flow, which then pops us back down into politeness. But it's a sincere and authentic politeness rather than a fake, let's just get through this politeness. So I use this a lot. And what I do typically is I ask the client, and I'm going to ask you to think of yourself right now in a group that you are with a lot. And if you're an external coach and you're only working, piecemeal with companies, that's okay. Think of your family or something like that. But let's take a look at these two questions. So I notice that our team, our group, our family, our community is missing opportunities to grow by slipping into the politeness mode. So you could click on the bar that says you strongly, you can kind of slide that bar. You either strongly disagree or you strongly agree. And then you personally, as a human being, as a coach, as the person that you are, you resist expressing your opinion sometimes out of concern or fear of sounding, adversarial, all the things we talked about before. So let's just take a minute. And sometimes this loop can be just a one-on-one relationship that you're in. We can use this politeness loop for many, many things. Great. So as this rolls in, we can see that it's interesting. We perceive the teams that we're on to be strong, we perceive others or a group usually to be less resistant to be ourselves than we see ourselves. So the group is more, we perceive that the group has less fear than we believe we ourselves have fear, which I think is really interesting. And it's again, the foundation around psychological safety. I used this questionnaire and was able to compare it with that original group I showed you over a 3-month period. We do it once a quarter, usually for most organizations. And this area itself went so much higher. Their original was a 4.2 and their new one is like an 8.9. So I find that to be just super exciting. And so thanks for all of you that put in your input. But just to think about that for a moment, that you perceive your team to be higher in psychological safety, literally, than you perceive yourself for expressing your own opinion. Just something to think about. So as we've got about 20 more minutes, and I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. There are 4 different ways that someone on a team could do psychological safety with their team on their own. And you as coaches can take this with, see if there's anything that works for you or resonates. You can create your own assessment using a 5 to 7 point Likert scale, which is great. You can also go to fearlessorganization.com and take the individual scan for free, just to sort of like get your result and be able to read through it. And I suggest you all do that. It's kind of fun. The only problem with it doesn't compare you and give you sort of those comparisons over time with other members of your organization. You can also, contact Fearless Organization to work with another organization, or you can, you can have them or me or whatever you can be trained as cultural captains within the organization. And just so it shows you how that works, like the consulting community would go into different groups or teams within an organization, obviously, and do all this work for them through HR, or the community of certified professionals would train people within the organization and, you know, act more as consultants, but kind of hand the ball off to that organization. But again, you as coaches, there are lots of ways you can think about doing this. One professional, really great coach I know, he just goes to those 7 questions and works with the company around the 7 questions. So we, of course, want everyone to be a 10 or, you know, the highest score. So what do we need to do with this particular question to get to a 10? So I would love to just open it up to Q&A if you want to take your mics off, or if you have any questions or comments.
Yes, Jerry, there are actually 2 questions in the queue.
Okay.
The first one was, does psychological safety apply to all kinds of settings? For example, families, friends, school?
It does. The book itself is geared more towards organizations, but I have seen a lot of data where people are using it in schools, communities, teams, and families. Now, when I say families, I'm really thinking hard in the back of my mind, have I actually read that? I don't know that I have, but I have seen it. I have seen it work. I haven't seen data on it. I've just seen it been brought up as a concept. You know, a lot of families have the ability to sit down with each other and really have very open conversations, and others keep things under the rug. So I think it has to be within a family organization. It has to be brought up in a way that all parties kind of agree to it, and it's not being pushed on them. I think a therapist or someone who works with family dynamics, family therapy, could certainly craft something around this that would be very impactful.
Thank you, Jerry. About the test, another question about the test. How many times should this test be done?
That's a terrific question. Ideally, I think every quarter is great, but at some point, hopefully organizations get really cohesive, but we always seem to slip back. You know, it's like 10 steps forward, 3 steps back. So we typically do it quarterly. If there's not kind of the budget for that, or it's just too time consuming, every 4 months or so. I think when you wait too long, some of these concepts kind of slip away. And so it's important to keep that ball rolling. If you as a coach are working on working with a small group and you're also doing individual coaching, or even if you're not, what I like to do is just send everyone like once a month, how's it going with, you know, some of the things that you're working on, and just kind of keep it fresh in their mind. I like to have them set up a personal development goal. So when I ask that question, what can you do personally around those domains? At the end, I have them pick one personal/professional goal that they're going to work on over the quarter. And so I will ask them, you know, how's it going with slowing down and being more present for your team? Or, you know, how's it going with, you know, putting down your distractions and looking people in the eye? And I think just keeping it top of mind just reminds people like, yeah, we're doing this work for a reason.
Thank you, Jerry. The question about, does this survey take the turnover in consideration?
It does. And I think the best way to approach that, number one, this is really important when an organization is going through a lot of turnover, because there's already kind of this psychological mistrust that's happening, or a feeling of uncertainty. And so once things kind of the dust settles, it's a great time to bring this in. When there is turnover, so we're bringing a new group member in, or we've lost a really powerful group member, it's important for the practitioner to sort of do a one-on-one first with that person and just explain, you know, the history with that company around psychological safety, to be very transparent with past results with that person and where we'd like to see the team go, and to create a sense of safety for them. Before I even do the psychological safety scan, I like to either do a group, you know, hello, here's what psychological safety is, or even a quick one-on-one. So I meet each of the team members for 10, 15 minutes. We introduce ourselves on Zoom. That way they get comfortable with me. They understand that, you know, these answers are authentic, please. And, you know, they're completely confidential. And we really want you to give your most honest opinion so we can get the most out of this exercise together.
There's another question from Brenda. Have you seen this work in K-12 public schools? What works best in that environment? Do you start with administration first? Also, who is the author of the direct book mentioned?
Yeah, so first, I'll start with the last question. It's Amy Edmondson, and she is a leadership professor at Harvard. She's been there for years. Like, this research started in the 1990s. And I think she recently came out with either a book or a small series on hybrid work, you know, so working from home, how that creates even more issues. As far as the schools, I have not seen or read anything about programs there. I think it's a fantastic idea, and I would encourage, you know, exploring that. I wish I knew more, but I could see it being incredibly powerful, especially around things like inclusion and diversity and willingness to help. You know, the thing with younger people is when we talk about attitude toward risk and failure, we don't want them to be, there's a fine line, I think, depending on the maturity of our judgment. And so we don't want to be completely safe to take risks, because sometimes those risks are impulsive risks that can hurt someone else's feelings, you know, could be potentially dangerous for the person. So, you know, just like parents raising a child, you don't want them to live in fear, but you don't want them to be impulsive and dangerous and, you know, super high on the risk threshold scale. But as far as a program for schools, I think it'd be fantastic.
Thank you, Jerry. There is another question. What are the challenges do you face when working with teams to establish a more psychological safe environment?
Well, I think every group is so different, but some of the challenges are that people could feel, one challenge is that there is definitely emotion that comes up, whether it's really good emotion and tears or stuff that's been held in so long. And so often there is, you know, crying, sometimes there's swearing, sometimes there's things that happen, but it's never, you know, it's not malicious, and it's self-discovery. So as a practitioner, kind of balancing and giving space for those emotions, you know, as coaches or therapists or providers, we want to kind of jump in and fix, you know, we're often perceived as fixers. And it's really important to just let the room breathe, let people have their emotions, you know, so people are having their emotions, and people around us are also having emotion as they're watching their colleagues make breakthroughs. So that would be one challenge. Other challenges are if things start to slip backwards. And I haven't had that happen yet. I could see how it could happen over time if they're not constantly working on these things. But I think what happens is once they get used to these concepts, it almost becomes like a checklist. Like, you know, I get up in the morning, I do these things, and I also want to remember, am I being helpful? Am I being inclusive? You know, am I being open and honest and not holding back? You know, I haven't had too many setbacks or challenges that I can name. Typically, it's been very powerful, good, forward-moving work. I guess I will say measurement. So while we can measure the psychological safety based on input, the goal is, of course, to feel safe as individuals, but for high performance. So how do we as practitioners measure that performance, measure the return on investment of time and energy that they're putting into these group dynamics. And so I think a really good idea to tie into this, which I do in my coaching anyway, but to tie in, what would it look like in 6 months if we increase your psychological safety by 20%? Is it money? Is it something else? Is it feeling more confident that you can allow your staff to do their work and you don't have to micromanage, those types of things. And I will say that I think the scan is great, but there are also you can use these concepts and create your own way of fostering psychological safety. I'll just say that. I love the scan because of what it does, and it's very robust, but, and if I were a data analyst, or I was really great at those types of things that you do when you go into a computer and make things work, that would be one thing, but I think it's great as is. There are other ways you can spin it off just using the concepts of psychological safety.
Okay, Jerry, thank you. There is another question here. Is there any relation with psychological contract and psychological safety?
I don't know. I honestly just don't know the answer to that. So I can't speak to it.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
Okay. We are open to more questions. Please, if you have any questions, you can write on the chat or you can speak up.
Yeah. And the book, The Fearless Organization is a great book. The audio is great and the regular book is really nice. And I'm always here to answer any questions you have. I can send you information, whatever you need. You can contact me through LinkedIn or through my email. No problem at all. I love kind of spreading this concept because I just think that it's really a powerful thing. And, we can continue with questions, but I would love to hear just, on the Menti, if there was one or two takeaways that you got from today, and again, if you already knew about this concept, it may have been repetitive, but there's a lot around it. And words from me can't speak powerfully enough about the impact this work makes on organizations. It's kind of, I don't want to use the word miraculous, but what happens with teams that are just dysfunctional, not cohesive, is amazing, because suddenly you're just showing up, you're being vulnerable, you're being raw, and you're trusting your colleague because you're in this beautiful container setting the stage. You're in a safe environment to just explain your feelings, use feelings, talk about what's really happened or happening, what you want, and everyone gets on board, and it's incredible.
So Jerry, we have Sylvia here. Yes, Sylvia, please go on. Sylvia, you raised your hand. You have a question?
Yes, I do. Can you hear me?
Yes, Sylvia, we can hear you. Sylvia.
Okay. What do you then do when you discover that it's actually your team leader who does not have the psychological safety and you have it? So how do you go about it? What do you do? Because it's going to pull you down. It's going to weigh you. And no matter how much psychological safety you have or can contain, when you discover that your leader or your coach doesn't have it, it's going to affect you. So what do you do in such a situation?
Well, hopefully when we're working with psychological safety as professionals, that leader is responsible for himself and he is sitting at that table. So he needs to hear what other people have to say, and he needs to be open to hearing honest feedback. And if he can't handle that, then he needs a lot more coaching. And hopefully when we're doing this work in organizations, HR is on board. And if there's that much negative feedback and that much pushback to change, then that guy or gal needs to be removed or have really, very intense coaching, because it's no longer acceptable to be like that. And I know what you're talking about. There are plenty of organizations that that I've worked with and am working with that are like that. The saddest thing, going back to a challenge, is that those are the organizations that won't work on psychological safety. And so it puts the the direct report or, you know, members of that group into a really hard position. And that's the toxicity that we're trying to eliminate through psychological safety as a whole. Like that is the mission of psychological safety, to have no one experience that kind of inability to get through to their boss, or to not trust their boss.
We have also Safa Suleiman raised her hand. Yes, Safa, please go on.
Safa, you're muted.
Safa, unmute yourself and speak.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello?
There we go. Hi, we can hear you now.
Okay, I'm Safa. I would like to ask you about the awareness, how to increase awareness of psychological safety for employers of companies. Because I was working at a company, and it's a big group, a multinational, but the employer isn't aware of the psychological safety and how to increase it in the environment, and how it matters for taking risks and to less or minimize the high turnover in the place. So how can I solve this problem?
Okay, so one idea, depending on like the way the organization is run, is to sit down with HR, learning and development, or someone who has influence and say, I just want to explain this incredible concept to you and where it came from. So the beginning of this presentation, I think it can't be powerful enough to pull up that Project Aristotle from Google. I mean, it was like over 1 million people, or 1 million people in 180 groups were surveyed over 3 years. And this was a huge undertaking. So right there, you've got the 5 elements of high performance teams, high performing organizations. And the linchpin, without it, boom, you have nothing. Without psychological safety, you have nothing. And if HR understands that, and understands that people in that organization, that law firm, on any level are not safe, and they're not safe to take risks, then there's going to be a big problem. And if that problem isn't resolved, the organization is going to sort of disrupt.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. And if you're going to get the PDF of this presentation, and if you'd like to talk about, I can help you walk through a conversation or something like that. No problem. You can just reach out.
Yes, sure. It will help us because we are in Egypt. I think a big companies, or most of companies, are not aware of psychological safety.
Yeah, and that's a good point. It's a rather new concept, and I think culture in the United States has started to change with some of these, Silicon Valley, California companies. They're run by younger people. So the culture, that feeling of feeling good, is very important to them. Whereas the majority, even still in the United States, the majority of companies are not like that. And I would imagine globally, this is a concept that's very new. But we're predicting that in the next decade, this will be as important as physical safety. Companies or factories, they all have safety standards. And we believe that this will be as important as mental health, emotional health becomes an epidemic, and it's increased tenfold since the pandemic. It's vital that psychological safety exists. We can get into the whole philosophy of that, but I just think it's really important. And yes, it's hard to introduce the concept. Another idea is just to Google yourself, psychological safety with difficult companies or something like that. And it will give you some good information. There's a lot of great information out there. And that's what's terrific.
Yes,
it's a new
sure.
concept, but you'll find it.
Thank you. We'll take the last call. Robin, please raise your hand.
Yeah. Thanks for the presentation. One thing I noticed is to create impact in a smaller organization is relatively easier, or it can also be very difficult, because of the lack of safety in a small environment.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I can also see that the motivation for for employees to open up and become more psychologically vulnerable may not be there just because of the sheer numbers they're hiding behind. So a huge organization of 60,000 employees, most people I hear when I talk to them is like, what's the point? Nothing's going to happen.
Well, we have to start in the middle. We don't necessarily start at the top, we start in the middle. So while it would be lovely to like only give it to the leadership development team or something like that, you know, your SVPs and your GVPs and things like that, what we try to do, so let's just say that you, Robin, are Senior Vice President of Marketing for Organization X. So you would take that scan with your marketing team, which should be a smaller team, you know, sort of like your vertical, but then you would also take it with your cross-functional leaders. And hopefully, as we start to create this grid between different groups, different tiers, and different verticals in a company, it becomes contagious. We see people more willing to help. We see people being kinder. We see people slowing down, connecting, you know, reversing on their negative habits. And so it's sort of a trickle effect. So it's not always a trickle down. It has to sort of be a trickle up and trickle sideways. And I understand what you're saying. The larger companies, ironically, Google, if you Google now psychological safety at Google, you will see that there's a lot of complaints. Some teams are fantastic. Many teams do not have psychological safety there, which is very interesting since they're the ones who started this whole darn thing. So I love your question. Thank you. And so I just want to thank all of you for showing up this morning, this evening, this afternoon, wherever you are. I really appreciate having this connection with you. And if I can be of service or of help at any time, just with a quick conversation, I am more than happy to do that.
Thank you so much, Jerry, for this insightful presentation. Thanks to everyone also who has attended and participated today. And thanks for your questions as well. And looking forward to see you next week with new Transformational Tuesdays with CTE. Thank you and see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.